Adrian Ernest Bailey. On a quiet September night in 2012, a crime unfolded in Melbourne that would ignite national outrage, reshape how Australians viewed public safety, and expose the terrifying truth about a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. This is the story of Adrian Ernest Bailey, a man whose long history of violence went unchecked for years, and Jill Meagher, a 29-year-old woman whose final walk home became the center of one of Australia's most haunting true crime cases. It began as an ordinary Friday. Jill Meagher, an ABC radio employee, spent the evening out with colleagues in the inner-city suburb of Brunswick. She was known for her warmth, intelligence, and bright presence, someone who lit up a room without trying. Her night was normal, comfortable, safe, or so it seemed. But predators like Bailey count on normal nights. They blend into the background, watching and waiting for the moment someone's guard falls for just long enough. Jill left the bar shortly after 1 a.m., insisting she was fine to walk the short distance home. She declined a coworker's offer to accompany her, something many people do without fear. After all, it was Brunswick busy, well-lit, familiar, a place where danger didn't feel real. Meanwhile, not far away, Adrian Ernest Bailey was roaming the streets with purpose. Born July 14, 1971, Bailey had a long history of violent sexual offenses. He was a convicted rapist, a man who had attacked women repeatedly, yet remained free. He had spent time behind bars, but had been released despite clear patterns of predatory behavior. On paper, he was dangerous. In reality, he was lethal. CCTV footage later showed the moment Bailey approached Jill on Sydney Road. To an untrained eye, it might look like a brief, uncomfortable encounter. But behind his words was manipulation, a performance he'd perfected over the years. He spoke to her, followed her, persisted. And then, out of the camera's view, he attacked. What happened next was brutal and fast. Bailey forcibly dragged Jill into a nearby laneway. She resisted. She pleaded. But Bailey had overpowered victims before, and he knew how to control them. He raped her in the darkness of that narrow alley, only meters away from passing cars and the safety she had almost reached. When she continued to fight, when she refused to break, he strangled her. In those final moments, Jill Meagher was a woman robbed of everything of her future, her dreams, her family, her life. Bailey dumped her body in a shallow grave near Gisborne South, an area he knew well enough to assume no one would stumble across. He covered her with dirt, drove away, and returned to his ordinary life as if nothing had happened. For days, Jill's disappearance gripped the entire country. Her husband, Tom Meagher, appeared on television, desperate and broken, begging for answers. Volunteers searched the streets. Police combed through hours of CCTV footage, slowly piecing together the trail she'd unknowingly left behind. Then came the break through the footage, showing Jill talking to a man in a blue hoodie. The man was Bailey. Police recognized him quickly. He was already known to them for his past sexual violence. When they brought him in for questioning, his story unraveled almost immediately. Under interrogation, Bailey admitted to the rape and murder. He claimed it was a spur-of-the-moment attack, an excuse that collapsed under the weight of his violent history. There was no spontaneity in what he did, no accident, no momentary lapse. This was a predator acting exactly as he always had. The public outrage was explosive. How had a repeat rapist been allowed back into society with so few restrictions? How many chances had the justice system given him? How many red flags had been ignored? Jill Meagher's case forced the Australian public to confront the uncomfortable truth. Violent offenders like Bailey rarely stop on their own. They escalate. In court, the details were horrifying. Jill's final moments were laid out with clinical precision, leaving the courtroom and the country shaken. Bailey showed little remorse, offering hollow apologies while insisting he never meant to kill her. But the evidence painted a different picture. A man who had hunted, attacked, and silenced a woman simply trying to walk home. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 35 years. Stephen Leslie Bradley. On a cold Sydney morning in July 1960, 8-year-old Graham Thorne left his home, expecting nothing more than another day of school. He lived in the quiet suburb of Bondi, in a neighborhood where parents didn't think twice about letting their children walk alone. But within an hour, Graham's disappearance would explode across every newspaper, radio station, and living room in Australia. And by the time the truth came out, the nation would realize it had crossed into a darker chapter of its history. This is the story of Stephen Leslie Bradley, a desperate man who believed someone else's good fortune should become his own, and the little boy whose murder changed Australia forever. It began several weeks before the kidnapping, when Graham's father, Basil Thorne, bought a ticket for the newly created Opera House lottery. To fund construction of the now iconic Sydney Opera House, the government offered a $100,000 jackpot, an amount that would equal millions today. At a time when privacy for lottery winners did not exist, Basil's name, photo, and home address were splashed across every front page in the city. Overnight, a modest middle-class family was thrust into the spotlight, recognized on the street, and discussed by strangers. One of those strangers was Stephen Bradley, a Hungarian immigrant with a troubled past and a hunger for money he had never been able to earn honestly. Bradley, once known as Istvan Baranyai, had lived in Australia for a decade without ever achieving stability. He lied, manipulated, and schemed his way from job to job, from one failed plan to another. When he read that the Thorne family had won a fortune, he saw an opportunity, not for theft, but for ransom. He convinced himself that he could take their child, demand a payout, and disappear. He had no criminal sophistication, no organized partners, no safe house. What he did have was desperation. On June 14, 1960, Bradley arrived at the Thorne home, pretending to be looking for someone named Mr. Bognor. He wore dark glasses, spoke in a heavy accent, and claimed he must have the wrong place. But while he acted confused, he confirmed their address and telephone number, making sure he had the correct details for his plan. Mrs. Thorne remembered the encounter vividly, but at the time, she had no idea she had just met the man who would take her son. On the morning of July 7th, Graham walked to the usual street corner, where a family friend picked him up every day for the drive to school. But when she arrived, Graham wasn't there. She assumed he had already left, but when she checked with the Thornes, panic began to spread. Within minutes, police were notified. 70 minutes after Graham left the house, a call came in. Mrs. Thorne answered and heard a man say coldly, "I have your son." Sergeant Larry O'Shea grabbed the phone. Bradley demanded $25,000 and threatened, "If you don't get the money, I'll feed the boy to the sharks." He promised to call back with instructions, but when he phoned again later that night, he abruptly hung up before giving details. The entire country became transfixed as officers, reporters, neighbors, and even off-duty soldiers searched every corner of Sydney. The kidnapping of a child was unheard of in Australia. Families didn't lock doors. Children played outside until sunset. The idea that someone would snatch an 8-year-old for ransom struck at the core of national identity. But despite the vast search, there was no sign of Graham. The first clue emerged the next day. Graham's school case, carefully placed beside a busy road surrounded by bushland. Soon after, his cap, raincoat, and lunch bag were discovered tossed nearby. Officers feared the worst, but continued searching day and night. 5 weeks later, on August 16th, children playing in the suburb of Seaforth stumbled upon a blue tartan rug in thick bushes. They had noticed it earlier, but only mentioned it casually to their parents. When adults investigated, they made a horrifying discovery. Inside the rug was the body of Graham Thorne. He was still in his school uniform, his small hands and feet tied, a silk scarf knotted brutally around his neck. The medical examination revealed he had been struck on the head and likely suffocated soon after the abduction. Forensic science would now do something remarkable. It would expose a murderer almost step by step. Tiny plant fragments embedded in the rug were traced to two specific types of cypress trees. These plants grew together in almost no gardens in Sydney. Soil on Graham's shoes revealed he had been stored under a building with pink mortar. Fibers on the rug matched those found in a nearby apartment building where Stephen Bradley had recently lived. Police were closing in. Meanwhile, Bradley had already fled Australia with his wife Magda and their children, boarding the SS Himalaya and heading for Europe. But before leaving, he had sold the car he used, a blue 1955 Ford Custom Line. Inside that car, investigators found dog hair identical to the Bradleys' Pekingese, paint fragments matching the rug, and traces of soil identical to the yard of their former home. Detectives also found forgotten film negatives at Bradley's previous address. Developed, they revealed photos of Bradley's family sitting on the exact blue tartan rug that had been wrapped around Graham's body. Every piece of evidence pointed in one direction. 8 days after the body's discovery, detectives located Bradley in Colombo, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Though Australia had no extradition treaty, a lengthy legal fight ended with Colombo agreeing to hand him over. As the plane carrying Bradley touched down in Sydney, he allegedly confessed that Graham had died accidentally in the trunk of his car, but forensic testing proved otherwise. A volunteer breathed the air inside an identical sealed car trunk for 7 hours without suffocating. Graham had not died accidentally. He had been violently assaulted and killed shortly after being taken. Bradley's trial lasted only 9 days. The prosecution presented forensic evidence so overwhelming that the courtroom gasped more than once. When Mrs. Thorne was asked to identify her son's killer from a lineup, she refused to place her hand on him. "I will not put my hand near him," she said. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in jeers, but Bradley showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison. Inside, he was considered a pariah, a child killer, a manipulator, a man who blamed everyone but himself. After years of assaults from other inmates, he was eventually placed in protective custody. On October 6, 1968, he collapsed and died of a heart attack while playing tennis in Goulburn Jail. He was 42. The case didn't end with him. The thorns moved, but never healed. Basil died in 1978, still haunted by the loss of his son. Australia changed forever. Lottery winners were no longer publicly identified without consent. Kidnapping laws were rewritten, and forensic science earned a new level of respect nationwide. One crime, one unimaginable tragedy, transformed the nation's sense of safety. Graham Thorne had been on his way to school. He never made it to class, and Australia never returned to the innocence it had before that morning. Martin John Bryant. On April 28, 1996, Martin John Bryant, a 28-year-old man from Newtown, Tasmania, embarked on a killing spree that would leave Australia stunned and grieving. Born on May 7, 1967, Bryant's early life was marked by isolation, mental disability, and social alienation. Diagnosed with an IQ of 66 in childhood, he was placed in special education classes and described by teachers as detached from reality, unemotional, and often disruptive. Bullied mercilessly by his peers, Bryant's parents sought psychiatric help on multiple occasions, and by 1984, a formal evaluation by Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax identified him as mentally retarded and exhibiting personality disorder traits. Despite these diagnoses, Bryant's life in adulthood revealed a man increasingly disconnected from social norms and moral reasoning. The death of his father, in an apparent suicide, left him emotionally indifferent, and a disability pension sustained him while he drifted through life, taking odd jobs as a handyman and gardener. One of these jobs introduced him to Helen Harvey, an heiress to the Tattersall's lottery fortune, who befriended Bryant, allowed him to live with her, and showered him with financial generosity. Following Harvey's death in a car accident, Bryant became the sole beneficiary of her estate, inheriting a Hobart mansion and over $500,000 in assets. In 1993, due to his diminished capacity, Bryant's mother secured a guardianship order, placing his assets under trusteeship. During this period, he traveled extensively both domestically and internationally, visiting locations such as Singapore, Bangkok, London, Sweden, Los Angeles, Frankfurt, Copenhagen, Sydney, Tokyo, Poland, and Auckland. Frustrated by social rejection and isolation, Bryant's behavior became increasingly erratic, with repeated attempts to seek attention through unusual and sometimes troubling acts. By 1996, he had accumulated firearms, including AR-10 and AR-15 semi-automatic rifles, along with shotguns and ammunition, which he stored at his home in secrecy. He had also purchased accessories for these weapons, including a strong sports bag to carry ammunition, and had made inquiries at gun shops about other firearms. On that fateful morning of April 28th, Bryant awoke unusually early at 6 a.m., set his alarm, and by 9:47 a.m. had left his house, leaving ammunition scattered in the hallways. At 10:30 a.m., he purchased a cigarette lighter and then a bottle of tomato sauce, paying in small coins at times, before traveling to Fawcett Village and stopping at a service station to buy coffee with 5 and 10-cent coins. His actions were observed as odd, including a surfing board on his car roof, despite poor surf conditions that day. Around 11:45 a.m., Bryant arrived at the Seascape guest accommodation owned by David and Sally Martin. He entered the property, fired several shots, gagged Mr. Martin, and stabbed him, killing both Martins in the process. Shortly thereafter, he interacted briefly with a visiting couple, insisting the property was closed due to family absence, before leaving and proceeding toward the Port Arthur Historic Site. Arriving around 1:10 p.m., Bryant joined a line at the toll booth, eventually paying the entry fee and parking near the Broad Arrow Cafe. There, he appeared nervous, continually checking the car park and fidgeting with his hands, mumbling to himself, and making small talk with visitors while largely disengaged from social interaction. He carried a large bag and a video camera, though staff ignored him. After finishing a meal on the cafe deck, Bryant returned his tray, set his bag down, and retrieved an AR-15 rifle with a 30-round magazine already partially loaded. He began shooting indiscriminately, starting with Mo Yi-eung and So Leng Chung of Malaysia, who were killed instantly at close range. As he moved through the cafe, Bryant fired at multiple tables, killing Kate Elizabeth Scott with a shot to the head, Jason Winter, and Anthony Nightingale, who had tried to protect his family. Others were grazed or struck by fragments, including Gerald and John Fiddler, who survived. Bryant continued shooting at couples Tony and Mrs. Kiston, Andrew and Mrs. Mills, killing the men while the women survived by dropping beneath tables. The chaos escalated as people realized the threat was real. Bystanders ducked for cover while Bryant moved to the next victims, fatally shooting Mervyn and Elizabeth Howard. Sarah Lowton ran to her mother, but both were struck. Her mother survived, but Sarah, 15, was killed. Bryant's spree continued as he moved through the cafe, firing rapidly at groups and individuals, creating a scene of carnage and terror. After the massacre inside the cafe, Bryant set fire to the Seascape guest house and attempted to escape, sustaining burns to one side of his body. He was captured by police and treated at Royal Hobart Hospital under heavy guard. The massacre ultimately claimed 35 lives and injured 37 others, marking it as Australia's deadliest mass shooting, In response, the Howard government introduced sweeping gun reforms, banning semi-automatic rifles and high-capacity shotguns while restricting other firearms. Despite Bryant's mental impairments, he was deemed fit for trial and, following legal counsel, pled guilty to all charges. On November 22, 1996, he was sentenced to 35 life sentences without the possibility of parole, effectively ensuring he would remain imprisoned for life. During incarceration, Bryant attempted suicide 6 times and spent significant periods in solitary confinement within a purpose-built suicide prevention cell. After more than a decade, he was moved to the Wilfrid Lopes Center, a secure mental health facility within Hobart, where he remains under observation in a unit for inmates with serious mental illnesses. John Justin Bunting. The Snowtown murders, also known as the Bodies in Barrels murders, stand as one of Australia's most chilling and grotesque crime sprees, a sequence of killings so calculated and horrific that it left an indelible mark on the nation. At the center of these crimes was John Justin Bunting, born September 4, 1966, in Inala, Queensland. Bunting, who would later be described as Australia's worst serial killer, emerged not as a solitary predator, but as the ringleader of a small, insidious subculture of murderers, men and women drawn into his orbit by manipulation, fear, or devotion. Over the course of 7 years, between 1992 and 1999, Bunting orchestrated the murders of 11 victims, their lives cut short in ways that ranged from blunt force trauma to strangulation, and culminating in the shocking discovery of 8 bodies hidden in barrels of acid in a disused bank in the small South Australian town of Snowtown. What made these killings particularly horrifying was not only the number of victims, but the intimate and often bizarrely bureaucratic method by which Bunting and his accomplices executed their crimes, targeting people they knew personally, while maintaining a veneer of normalcy to outsiders. Bunting's motivations were rooted in a twisted moral code. He claimed to despise pedophiles and homosexuals, yet his actions betrayed a desire for absolute control, sadistic pleasure, and financial gain. He would instruct his followers to terrorize, torture, and ultimately kill the victims, sometimes collecting their welfare payments posthumously, a grim testament to the cold and calculating nature of his criminal enterprise. Bunting first moved to Murray Bridge in November 1991, settling initially on Lomond Street, before relocating to Burdekin Avenue in 1997. It was from these suburban homes that he would groom and manipulate those around him, including his stepson James Vlasakis, whom he assumed a paternal role over, and Robert Wagner, a neighbor drawn into Bunting's deadly circle. Bunting's first known murder occurred in August 1992, when he invited Clinton Trezise, 22, to his home under the guise of a social visit. Trezise was beaten to death with a shovel in Bunting's living room, a brutal act that would be followed by years of additional murders. The body was buried in a shallow grave at Lower Light, South Australia, where it remained undiscovered for 2 years. Despite the initial murder remaining unsolved, Bunting openly boasted about it to Vlasakis, referring to Trezise with the derisive nickname Happy Pants. Subsequent victims were chosen with a combination of personal prejudice and opportunistic intent. Ray Davies, 26, an intellectually disabled man, was murdered in December 1995 after accusations of sexual impropriety surfaced from a former lover. Davies' death was concealed while Bunting and his accomplices continued to collect his welfare payments. Michael Gardner, 19, an openly gay man, fell victim in August 1997, and his body, along with that of Barry Lane, another gay man and crossdresser, would eventually be discovered in barrels in Snowtown. Lane had previously been in a relationship with Wagner and had assisted in concealing earlier murders, only to be eliminated when Bunting deemed him a risk. Thomas Trevelyan, 18, described as paranoid and mentally unstable, was similarly lured and executed after participating in prior crimes. Gavin Porter, 31, a heroin addict, was strangled in his car by Bunting and Wagner, his body later stored in a barrel. Troy Yude, Vlasakis' half-brother, was dragged from his bed and dismembered, another victim in Bunting's grotesque pattern of abuse. Frederick Brooks, 18, the intellectually disabled son of Jody Elliott, suffered prolonged torture before his death, including electric shocks and the insertion of burning objects into his body. Gary O'Dwyer, 29, disabled from a previous accident, was murdered to access his welfare payments, his body also ending up in Snowtown. Elizabeth Hayden, 37, the wife of an accomplice, was the only female victim, killed while her husband and sister were away. Finally, David Johnson, 24, Vlasakis' stepbrother, was lured to the Snowtown bank, where he was strangled, dismembered, and partially consumed by Bunting and Wagner in one of the most grotesque acts of the spree. The victims were subjected not only to murder, but also prolonged torture. Tools such as knives, saws, a double-barrel shotgun, coils of rope, tape, rubber gloves, pincers, pliers, clamps, and even a Variac machine were used to inflict pain. Victims were forced to call their torturers names like God, Master, and Lord Sir while being beaten, shocked, and mutilated. These acts were meticulously documented during the investigation and formed the backbone of the criminal trials that would follow. The investigation into these crimes began with suspicions raised after Elizabeth Hayden's disappearance. Police quickly recognized that her absence was inconsistent with her character and uncovered links to prior murders, including Trezise and Lane. The discovery of the barrels in May 1999 marked the horrifying culmination of years of investigative work. 8 bodies were found, stored in acid in a disused bank vault in Snowtown, while 2 additional bodies had been buried in a backyard in Salisbury North. The investigation revealed the lengths to which Bunting and his accomplices had gone to hide their crimes, moving the bodies between multiple locations in an attempt to evade detection. John Bunting, Robert Wagner, James Vlasakis, and Mark Hayden were all arrested, and Bunting was eventually convicted on 11 counts of murder on September 8, 2003, receiving 11 consecutive life sentences without parole. Wagner was convicted on 7 counts after pleading guilty to 3 murders, while Vlasakis, who cooperated with authorities, received 4 life sentences for his role in the killings. John Leslie Coombs. It all began with a leg. Not a living leg, not a wounded leg, but a tattooed, waterlogged limb that had washed ashore on a Phillip Island beach in Victoria, Australia. For investigators, it was a grim signal that something far darker was at play, the start of one of the most gruesome murder investigations in the region's history. The body had vanished, leaving only a single limb to hint at the horror that had taken place. In the days that followed, more body parts emerged, scattered across the beaches, turning a serene seaside community into a scene of macabre fascination and fear. The discovery marked the beginning of the end for John Leslie Coombs, a man whose violent tendencies spanned decades and whose criminal life was defined by murder, deception, and dismemberment. Coombs, at 56, would eventually plead guilty to strangling and dismembering Rachel Betts, a 27-year-old childcare worker, in her friend's home at Phillip Island. But the story of his crimes stretches far beyond that single act of brutality. His criminal history was long and bloody. His first known victim, Michael Peter Sperani, a 20-year-old from Mount Martha, vanished while on a fishing trip in February 1984. Coombs, who was no stranger to criminal activity, would later admit to murdering Sperani by running over him with a motorboat before disposing of the body in the water, leaving the elements and the bay's creatures to to finish what he had started. Later that same year, in November, Henry Raymond Kells, 44, was stabbed to death in his Chelsea home. Coombs, along with an accomplice, Andrew Harold Opie, faced the law for Kells's murder, resulting in Coombs receiving a life sentence in December 1985. Yet even imprisonment could not contain the violent impulses of this man. In 1988, Coombs, together with another convicted killer, Dean Leslie Ashley, broke out of Ararat jail, a daring escape that involved keys, makeshift ladders, and a piping bridge over razor wire fences. The fugitives were recaptured after a brief 3-day spree, during which Coombs's reputation as a dangerous, cunning man solidified further. While in prison, his conduct remained disruptive. Reports describe him as involved in confrontations over gambling debts, strange homemade ropes, and frequent psychiatric consultations. Despite these behaviors, assessments for parole suggested he did not pose a significant threat to the community, a judgment that, in hindsight, would prove tragically flawed. Coombs's release in 1996 came after more than a decade of incarceration, but freedom did not temper his lethal tendencies. Within months, he was arrested over the murder of Spirani 12 years prior, eventually serving a sentence that allowed for parole again in February 2007. 2.5 years after this release, the violent cycle resumed with Rachel Betts. On August 12, 2009, Coombs strangled Betts at the Port Phillip home of her friend, Nicole Godfrey. After killing her, he dismembered her body in a bath, placed the parts in plastic bags, and discarded them from a local pier, the water carrying the remains to the shore over the following days. Godfrey, who had been in an adjacent bedroom during the gruesome act, later admitted to giving Coombs false alibis, fearing for her own safety. The court would hear her chilling account. "I know she was chopped up in the bathroom," she told police. "He took her into the bathroom because I was in bed, and I had the TV a little bit on, and I had my hands in my ears so I couldn't hear anything." For Sandra Betts, Rachel's mother, the news was devastating. Outside the court, she labeled Coombs a cruel monster, a man for whom murder was preferable to sex. Her victim impact statement later described the irrevocable grief inflicted upon her family, a life sentence of loss caused by a man with a history of homicide and no genuine remorse. Coombs's pattern was clear: the violence of his murders, the meticulous dismemberment, and the constructed lies following each act demonstrated a terrifying consistency. Justice Jeffrey Nettle, in sentencing Coombs to life imprisonment without parole in August 2011, noted the frightening predilection for homicide the man displayed and warned that, if given the opportunity, he would kill again. Coombs's defense tried to contextualize his actions, claiming he had been sexually abused as a child, and that his last murder followed a snap triggered by a sexual proposition. The court dismissed much of this, recognizing his propensity for deceit and manipulation. Further attempts to frame his army service as a formative source of his brutality were countered by the fact that Coombs had never seen combat in Vietnam. Yet his history of cruelty extended even beyond humans. Reports from acquaintances described him as sadistic toward animals, a detail that painted a fuller picture of the man behind the murders. His killing methods were as varied as they were brutal: a motorboat for Spirani, stabbing for Kells, and strangulation followed by dismemberment for Betts. Each act reflected both opportunism and a cold, calculated approach to murder. Coombs's physical description added a mundane, almost incongruous layer to his terror. Short, round-headed, mildly obese, with a crew cut, heavy beard, glasses, and a tattoo on his left arm, he did not fit the cinematic image of a predator, yet his capacity for evil was unmistakable. His repeated brushes with the justice system demonstrated systemic failures. Paroled multiple times despite prior convictions for murder, Coombs's life became a chronicle of repeated lethal offenses. Each parole period ended in more death, leaving law enforcement, victims' families, and the community to reckon with the consequences of misjudged risk assessments. The legal proceedings for Rachel Betts's murder revealed a pattern of manipulation and perversion of justice. Godfrey's cooperation with police, though initially reluctant, helped secure Coombs's guilty plea. The trial underscored the brutality of the crime and the callousness with which Coombs approached the act of killing, his lack of remorse emphasized repeatedly by the presiding judge. Reflecting on his entire criminal career, Coombs's life was defined by a horrifying blend of opportunistic violence, careful calculation, and an apparent inability to empathize with his victims. The chronology of his murders, Spirani in February 1984, Kells in November 1984, and Betts in August 2009, reveals both the persistence of his homicidal impulses and the tragic failures of the justice system to contain them. His sentencing to life imprisonment without parole in August 2011 marked the final chapter in a story that spanned decades of murder, escape, and manipulation. Justice Nettles' remarks during sentencing captured the horror succinctly. Coombs's actions displayed an utter disregard of the law and basic norms of society and depraved inhumanity towards the deceased, her family, and her loved ones. For Rachel Betts's family, the sentence offered some measure of closure, though the scars of Coombs's violence would endure. Kevin Crump. In the early days of November 1973, the quiet towns of northern New South Wales were about to witness a wave of violence that would etch itself into the annals of Australian crime. Kevin Crump, a man whose name would become synonymous with brutality, and his accomplice Alan Baker embarked on a chilling spree that would leave 2 victims dead and countless lives scarred forever. Crump, born in 1948, had already lived a life marked by petty crime and brushes with the law, but nothing could have prepared the community for the sheer savagery of what was to come. On the night of November 3, 1973, Crump and Baker, armed with a .308 rifle, spotted a man sleeping in his car along the roadside near Narrabri. The man, Ian James Lamb, 43, was a cotton picker, traveling through the area in search of seasonal work and trying to save money by sleeping in his vehicle. Lamb's life was extinguished in an instant, shot down by 2 strangers in what would later be classified as a thrill killing. There was no motive beyond the sadistic pleasure of taking a life, and the randomness of the act sent shockwaves through the community. Just 3 days later, the pair's cruelty escalated further. They camped near the home of Brian and Virginia Morse in Collarenebri, a property one of the men had briefly worked on as a migrant farm laborer. For 2 days, they watched the Morse household, waiting for the family to leave, before abducting 35-year-old Virginia Morse. Her husband and 3 children had left the property, and in those moments, Virginia's life was about to spiral into a nightmare that defies comprehension. The men drove her across back roads toward Queensland, stopping at hotels and garages along the way, spending some of the $30 they had stolen from the Morse homestead on beer and petrol. Virginia pleaded for her life, tears streaming down her face as she begged for mercy. Yet the pleas fell on ears hardened by violence and indifference. When they reached the Weir River near Mooney, the horror intensified. Tied to a tree, Virginia was raped and tortured repeatedly, enduring a level of brutality that left an indelible mark on anyone who would later hear her story. The men's violence culminated in an execution-style killing when one of them shot her between the eyes, leaving her body to be rolled into the river and her clothes burned, a grotesque attempt to erase evidence of their crimes. The randomness of Lamb's murder and the calculated horror inflicted upon Virginia Morse revealed a chilling pattern. These men were capable of unspeakable cruelty, driven not by motive or reason, but by a desire to dominate and destroy. Their rampage did not go unnoticed for long. 10 days after Lamb's murder, Crump and Baker were en route to the Hunter region with intentions of committing a burglary. Their stolen vehicle was spotted near Maitland, prompting a high-speed police pursuit. During the chase, the duo shot at officers, ramming one police car off the road and seriously injuring a constable named Bill Millward, who would carry scars from that encounter for the rest of his life. The chase ended at a roadblock in Woodville, where the men attempted to flee on foot through the bush while continuing to fire at pursuing officers. A coordinated ground and air search eventually led to their arrest in a nearby river 3 hours later. In the aftermath of their capture, Crump attempted to shift blame in his police statement, claiming he had been forced by Baker to kill Virginia Morse and that he had no desire for her death. "I was prepared to kidnap Mrs. Morse and even to sleep with her. But once again, as with Mr. Lamb, I did not want to be a part of her death. It was a choice of either me or Mrs. Morse," he said, attempting to paint himself as a reluctant participant. Despite compelling evidence implicating Crump in Virginia's murder, jurisdictional boundaries meant he was not charged with her killing, which had occurred in Queensland. However, he faced charges for Lamb's murder, as well as for rape and conspiracy to murder Virginia Morse. At trial, both Crump and Baker pleaded not guilty to 4 charges: the murder of Ian Lamb, conspiracy to murder Virginia Morse, maliciously wounding a police officer, and shooting at police with intent to prevent lawful apprehension. The jury, confronted with overwhelming evidence, deliberated for just 1 hour and 45 minutes before convicting the pair on all counts. Baker remained expressionless at the verdict, while Crump shuddered and avoided eye contact, staring at the floor. When Justice Taylor delivered the sentence, it was clear the court saw the men not as human beings, but as obscene animals, deserving of a lifetime behind bars. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment plus 55 years, with the judge explicitly stating that the sentence should ensure they would die in prison, a reflection of the gravity of their crimes and the societal need for justice. Details of the torture inflicted on Virginia Morse were suppressed during the trial, deemed too graphic for public dissemination. But the horror endured by the mother of 3 remains a haunting backdrop to the proceedings. In the years that followed, Crump and Baker would attempt to challenge their sentences. In 1997, NS-Oddsaller's legislation was passed to ensure that both men would remain incarcerated for life. Baker challenged the law in the High Court, but lost in October 2004, solidifying the court's authority to enforce life imprisonment without parole. Crump, meanwhile, had his sentence redetermined at 30 years, with multiple parole applications subsequently denied. In May 2012, the High Court ruled definitively that Crump had no grounds to appeal the laws keeping him imprisoned until incapacitated or near death. Despite decades of legal wrangling, the court was resolute. The nature of his crimes warranted that he should never walk free. The scars of Crump's violence extend beyond the victims to those who confronted him during his criminal acts. Bill Millward, the police officer shot in the face during the high-speed chase, still carries the bullet scar on his forehead and reflects on the moment with a mixture of pain and pride. He survived not because of luck, but because of his courage and sense of duty. Millward's testimony and advocacy underscore the ongoing trauma inflicted on those who faced Crump's wrath and the persistence of victims' families and law enforcement in ensuring justice was upheld. Brian Morse, Virginia's husband, spent decades lobbying for legal assurances that his wife's killer would never be released, demonstrating the enduring impact of Crump and Baker's crimes. Their relentless pursuit of justice was mirrored by the courts, which, even decades later, confirmed that Crump would die in prison. Kevin Crump's life behind bars is not merely a punishment, but a societal acknowledgement of the magnitude of his violence. His crimes, defined by thrill killings, abduction, rape, and torture are reminders of the darkest capabilities of human nature. From the roadside execution of Ian Lamb to the prolonged torment and murder of Virginia Morse, the chilling saga of Kevin Crump and Alan Baker remains one of Australia's most notorious crime stories, a testament to the need for vigilance, the pursuit of justice, and the indelible scars left on victims, their families, and the officers who faced these men. Even decades after the events of November 1973, the legacy of Kevin Crump serves as a grim reminder that evil can manifest in the most calculated and horrifying ways, and that the law's unyielding response is crucial in preserving the safety and moral fabric of society. Roger Kingsley, Dean. In the early hours of November 18, 2011, the Quakers Hill nursing home in Sydney, New South Wales, became the site of one of the most chilling mass murders in Australian history. The residents, elderly men and women who had survived wars, hardship, and personal tragedies, were meant to spend their twilight years in peace, yet the night would turn into a nightmare that none could escape. Roger Kingsley Dean, a 35-year-old registered nurse entrusted with their care, had other plans. Dean, a man who outwardly seemed calm and professional, harbored a secret desperation. He had stolen 237 tablets of Endone, a powerful narcotic painkiller, and a morphine capsule from the home's medication cupboard. When his theft was discovered, he feared the consequences and, in a moment of twisted calculation, decided to destroy the evidence by setting fire to the nursing home. Around 4:50 a.m., Dean walked through the quiet halls of the home, carrying a stolen cigarette lighter. He first set fire to an empty bed in one of the rooms, a move that seemed almost casual, but moments later, he ignited another blaze in a room occupied by two immobile residents. Emergency services rushed to the scene to find black smoke pouring from the windows and terrified residents scrambling for safety. Many were rescued, but the delay in reporting the second fire proved fatal. By the time firefighters reached it, the flames had claimed lives that might have been saved with faster intervention. In total, 11 residents perished. Dorothy Wu, 85, Alma Smith, 73, Reginald Green, 87, Lola Bennett, 86, Ella Wood, 97, Urbana Alipio, 79, Cesar Galea, 82, Doris Beck, 96, Verna Webeck, 83, Dorothy Sterling, 80, and Neeltje Valke, 90. Some died instantly in the fire. Others succumbed to injuries later in hospital, their frail bodies unable to withstand the trauma. Standing outside as ambulance officers tried desperately to save lives, Dean presented himself as a hero to the media, giving interviews where he claimed to have rescued residents. "There was a fire, and I did what I could to get the residents out," he told Channel 7. "It's a bit overwhelming, but we got a lot of people out. That's the main thing." It was a chilling performance, one that hid his true motives. He had orchestrated the fire to cover his theft. Later, when Dean pleaded guilty to the murders, the court heard the extent of his planning and premeditation. The fire was not a moment of panic or carelessness. It was a calculated act to erase the evidence of stolen narcotics. The night before the fire, Dean had repeatedly entered the medication room, taking 237 tablets of Endone and a single capsule of morphine, drugs that could fetch a significant price on the street. When nursing home managers discovered the missing medication, Dean panicked and considered the implications for his career and freedom. The next night, he created an opportunity. He sent 2 junior nurses on an unscheduled break, ensuring he would be alone, and set the deadly fires. Outside the court, the families of his victims expressed a mix of relief, grief, and anger. Ellie Valke, whose mother Neeltje Valke died at 90, said the life sentence was wonderful, yet the pain of loss remained unbearable. Amanda Tucker, granddaughter of Dorothy Sterling, expressed frustration that no punishment could ever undo the terror her grandmother endured. My Nana never made it out of that nursing home. Every time we picture my Nana, we wonder whether she was in pain, or if she was scared or screaming or needing help, she said. He walked straight past her and didn't help. It's never going to take the pain away from any of these families. The lives lost in that fire were remarkable in their resilience and their histories. Neeltje Valkai, 90, had survived the horrors of World War II in Holland, hiding Jews and her fiancé from German soldiers, risking her own life in the process. She and her family eventually migrated to Australia, building a life filled with warmth and family connections. Cesare Galea, 82, and his wife Valentina had fled Egypt after the war and spent decades together, celebrating 63 years of marriage that ended tragically in the blaze. Doris Beck, 96, a farmer's daughter and widow, had endured a lifetime of hardship with courage and spirit, only to have her final days cut short by the cruel act of a man she trusted. Urbana Alipio, 79, had raised 3 children as a single mother in the Philippines before moving to Australia to be with her family, living her final years surrounded by love and care, unaware of the danger that awaited her. The aftermath of the fire was devastating. Survivors, many immobile or suffering from severe health conditions, were dragged in their beds through the chaos, covered in soot and smoke, some barely conscious. Emergency workers described scenes that resembled a war zone. Beds lined the footpaths, residents moaning and gasping for air, firefighters crawling through black smoke to reach them. Those who survived carried with them the memory of horror, the terror of helplessness, and the loss of friends and fellow residents. Dean's calculated cruelty was apparent in every action. He had not only stolen medication, but had deliberately created a situation where lives could be lost to conceal his theft. Dean's sentencing was equally dramatic. In May 2013, he pleaded guilty to 11 counts of murder and 8 counts of recklessly causing grievous bodily harm. Justice Megan Latham delivered a life sentence without parole, describing Dean's actions as premeditated and deliberate. The terror and fear experienced by the victims must have been horrific, she said. A worse fate is difficult to imagine. She acknowledged the profound grief of the victims' families, noting that the consequences of Dean's crimes extended far beyond the immediate deaths, robbing families of cherished moments and memories. In the courtroom, some relatives fainted, overcome with emotion, while others embraced and celebrated that justice had been served. Paul Caccia, whose mother Emanuela died in the hospital from fire-related injuries, said, "He's a son of a he's lucky I didn't get my hands on him." Dean's lack of remorse and the calculated nature of his actions left an indelible mark on Sydney and on those who had once trusted him. His facade of heroism, his interviews with the media, and his calm demeanor at the court belied the horror he had inflicted. The lives of 11 vulnerable elderly residents were stolen, not by chance, but by the deliberate, selfish choices of a man who placed his own fear and greed above human life. Their stories, however, endure. Survivors and families remember them not only for the tragic way they died, but for the lives they lived, the love they gave, and the resilience they displayed in facing the final horrifying moments of their lives. Bandely Michael D. Bies. Bandely Michael Debs, born on 18th of July 1953 in Narre Warren, a southeastern suburb of Melbourne, Australia, would become one of the most notorious murderers in Victoria's criminal history. On the surface, Debs appeared unremarkable. A tiler by trade, a father of 5 children, a man leading what many would consider a normal life. Yet beneath this ordinary facade lurked a dangerous and calculated killer, a man capable of extreme violence, whose crimes would shock a nation and leave an indelible mark on the Victorian police force and the families of his victims. Debs' life would be defined not only by his murders, but by his cold, methodical approach to avoiding detection and the lasting consequences of his actions, which continue to resonate decades after his arrest. The first known murder attributed to Debs was that of Christy Mary Hardy, a troubled 18-year-old teenager. On the night of 17th June 1997, Hardy was soliciting for sex along the Prince's Highway when she encountered Debs. What began as a seemingly consensual meeting turned into a horrifying tragedy. Debs drove her to a secluded bush track in Upper Beaconsfield, where he forced unprotected sex upon her before executing her with a single gunshot to the back of her head. Her semi-naked body was discovered face down in the undergrowth by bushwalkers. For years, Hardy's murder remained unsolved, a chilling mystery that haunted both her family and the local community. DNA evidence eventually linked Debs to the crime, confirming what investigators had long suspected: that Christy Hardy had been a victim of cold-blooded murder, targeted not out of anger or passion, but for the sheer sake of violence. In May 2007, Debs was convicted of Hardy's murder and sentenced to a third consecutive term of life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Justice Stephen Kay, in handing down the sentence, described Debs' actions as entirely senseless, needless, and wanton, a callous and cowardly act against a defenseless young woman, highlighting that he had no prospect of rehabilitation and was beyond redemption. However, the murder of Christy Hardy was only part of Debs' criminal legacy. On the 16th August 1998, Debs escalated his violent tendencies, committing a crime that would stun the nation: the murders of 2 Victoria police officers, Sergeant Gary Silk and Senior Constable Rodney Miller. The officers were engaged in an undercover stakeout near the Silky Emperor restaurant in Moorabbin, Victoria, at approximately midnight. Their task was to monitor criminal activity linked to armed robberies, a routine operation that suddenly turned fatal. Debs, accompanied by his accomplice Jason Joseph Roberts, approached the officers and opened fire at close range, killing both men instantly. Silk was just 21 years old, and Miller was 28. These were men dedicated to serving and protecting their community, cut down in an act of sheer brutality that left the police force and the public in disbelief. The investigation into the Silk Miller murders, known as Operation Lorimer, was painstaking and complex. Police collected fragments of glass from the crime scene, which they suspected came from the getaway vehicle. Through meticulous testing and even tracing materials back to a Hyundai factory in South Korea, authorities narrowed down the vehicle model and linked it to the daughter of Bandali Debs. This connection ultimately led to the arrest of Debs and Roberts on 24 September 2001. Both men faced multiple charges, including murder and a series of armed robberies committed between March and July 1998. At trial, the evidence against Debs was overwhelming. Witnesses, forensic analysis, and the methodical reconstruction of events painted a picture of a man who was not only willing to kill, but also calculated in his approach to crime. Debs and Roberts were found guilty of murdering Silk and Miller, with both men receiving life sentences. Debs' sentence was particularly severe: 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Roberts, slightly younger and with a minimum term of 35 years, faced a similarly harsh fate. The court emphasized the cold-blooded nature of the killings and the impact on the victims' families, highlighting the senselessness of the murders and the lack of any mitigating circumstances. The repercussions of the Silk Miller murders extended beyond the courtroom. Victorian Police Minister Andre Hermeyer announced a reward of $500,000 for information leading to the capture of the killers, which underscored the high-profile nature of the case and the desperation for justice. The deaths of Silk and Miller had a profound impact on policing in Victoria, prompting internal reviews, changes in operational procedures, and heightened awareness of the risks faced by officers in the line of duty. The tragedy also inspired the Blue Ribbon Cup, an annual Australian rules football match between Hawthorn and St Kilda, established in 1999 to honor the officer's memory. The best player of the match receives the Silk Miller Medal, ensuring that their legacy continues to be remembered in the sporting and local communities. Deb's criminal behavior was not isolated to these 3 murders. While imprisoned, he remained under investigation for other violent acts, including the shooting murder of New South Wales prostitute Donna Ann Hicks in April 1995. DNA analysis linked him to the crime, though as of now, legal proceedings are still pending. Deb's personal life mirrored the chaos of his criminal activities. A father of 5, he endured the tragic loss of his youngest son, Joseph, who was found dead from a suspected drug overdose in 2003. These personal tragedies, however, did not diminish the calculated and remorseless nature of his crimes. In prison, Debs has engaged in psychology courses, life skills, and computer training, and is employed as a carpet cleaner. Yet these activities do little to mitigate the enormity of his offenses. Justice Stephen Kay, during the sentencing for Christy Hardy's murder, captured the essence of Debs's depravity, stating that his actions were utterly cowardly, callous, senseless murder in cold blood, and emphasizing that Debs had forfeited his right to ever be at large in the community. Outside the courtroom, Hardy's family expressed relief and closure, acknowledging that the sentence ensured Debs would never harm anyone again. The verdict served as both a denunciation of Debs' conduct and a symbolic affirmation of justice for the victims and their families. Paul Charles Denyer. Paul Charles Denyer, born April 14, 1972, would come to be known as the Frankston serial killer, a man whose crimes terrorized a quiet suburb of Melbourne, Victoria, during the summer of 1993. By the time he was 21, Denyer had already cemented his place in Australian criminal history as a sadistic killer, a man who murdered 3 young women in a spree of random, brutal violence, leaving families devastated and a community gripped with fear. The story of his crimes is as chilling as it is tragic, revealing the dark trajectory of a man whose obsession with death and hatred of women had been nurtured from childhood. Denyer's early years were far from ordinary. He was the 3rd of 6 children born to English working-class immigrants, Maureen and Anthony Denyer, who had settled in Campbelltown near Sydney. A seemingly minor accident, rolling off a table and injuring his head, would become a recurring family joke, hinting at a childhood punctuated by neglect and misunderstanding. Even as a boy, Paul displayed disturbing behaviors. He mutilated his sister's teddy bears, cut the family kitten, and hung it from a tree. At school, he assaulted a peer so violently that a pen lodged in the victim's throat. These early signs of aggression and cruelty were warnings ignored, seeds of the monster he would eventually become. When the Denyer family relocated to Victoria in 1981, Paul struggled to adjust. His weight and size made him stand out, and he became increasingly isolated, retreating into a fascination with knives, homemade weapons, and violent media. The trajectory of his violence escalated. By age 10, he had stabbed the family kitten and later disemboweled a friend's cat, acts which foreshadowed his eventual transition from animal cruelty to human slaughter. By his teenage years, Denyer had already amassed an arrest record, including theft, assault, and sexual coercion. Yet the warnings remained unheeded. By 1993, Denyer had become a social outcast. Unemployed and living with his girlfriend Sharon Johnson in Frankston, he spent his time plotting and fantasizing. The quiet streets of Frankston would soon bear witness to his lethal intentions. His first known murder occurred on June 12th, when 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens was found in Lloyd Park, naked from the waist up, her throat cut, and her body marked with multiple knife wounds. Elizabeth's murder was senseless, executed without motive, and it signaled the arrival of a killer whose only aim was to inflict pain and death. The attack was followed by a harrowing near miss. On July 8th, 41-year-old Rosa Toth was violently assaulted near Seaford. She fought for her life, biting denier's fingers to the bone, and escaped, her bravery saving her from becoming his next victim. That same evening, 22-year-old Debbie Freem, a new mother, went missing while fetching milk from a local store. 4 days later, her body was discovered, stabbed and strangled, yet again with no sexual assault, leaving authorities stunned and confirming their worst fears. A serial killer stalked Frankston. The community reacted with understandable fear. Women stayed indoors, streets emptied after dark, and the once bustling neighborhood became a ghost town. Police mounted a relentless investigation, canvassing every possible lead, establishing roadblocks and appealing for public vigilance. Despite their efforts, the killer remained elusive, a shadow in the suburb that thrived on unpredictability. On July 30th, 17-year-old Natalie Russell disappeared while riding her bike home from school. 8 hours later, her body was found, stabbed repeatedly with her throat cut in a level of savagery exceeding his previous attacks. But this time, denier left a critical piece of evidence, a fragment of skin from his own hand, inadvertently transferred onto Natalie during the attack. Coupled with sightings of a yellow Toyota Corona, the trail led directly to denier. Police quickly matched the vehicle to him and visited his apartment. He cooperated seemingly casually, offering explanations for his whereabouts, but his cut hands betrayed him. Within hours, denier was interrogated, and as DNA testing loomed over him, he confessed to all 3 murders and the attack on Toth. His confessions were chillingly detailed and devoid of emotion. Denier recounted stalking his victims, the preparation for each murder, and the final, brutal moments of their lives, with a detachment that horrified investigators. Elizabeth Stevens had been strangled, stabbed, and left to die in Lloyd Park. Debbie Freem had been forced into her car, threatened, strangled, and stabbed repeatedly, with her death followed by a cold collection of her belongings and the disposal of evidence. Natalie Russell's murder revealed premeditation. Denier had cut holes in a fence to ensure privacy for the attack, and followed her along the bike track before executing her with the same brutal efficiency. Throughout his confessions, Denier remained singularly focused on his hatred of women. When asked why he had targeted female victims, he replied simply, "I just hate 'em. General." Only his girlfriend Sharon seemed immune from this animosity, whom he described as a kindred spirit and the sole woman he would never harm. Psychologists later confirmed what the investigators already suspected. Denier was a sadist, a murderer who derived pleasure from the suffering he inflicted, whose violent tendencies and misogynistic impulses were amplified by early life trauma, but not caused solely by it. In December 1993, Denier was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, with no possibility of parole, plus an additional 8 years for the abduction of Rosa Toth. Justice Frank Vincent described the fear Denier had instilled in thousands of women in Frankston, a fear that would linger long after the physical threat had been neutralized. Denier's appeal reduced his non-parole period to 30 years, yet the horror of his crimes ensured that his name would be synonymous with terror for generations. Even from prison, Denier continued to exhibit disturbing behaviors, requesting cosmetic items and seeking information about gender reassignment surgery, yet demonstrating no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. His actions served as a grim reminder of the unpredictability and remorselessness of true psychopaths. The families of his victims were left to grieve, haunted by the randomness of his violence and the depth of his depravity. Peter Norris Dupas. Peter Norris Dupas born July 6, 1953, in Sydney, Australia, would go on to become one of the country's most notorious serial killers, leaving a trail of terror across Melbourne for decades. Known for his heinous crimes against women, including rape, mutilation, and murder. Dupas's criminal career spanned more than 3 decades, a chilling pattern of escalating violence that culminated in multiple life sentences. By the time he murdered Nicole Patterson in 1999, Dupa had already accumulated a lengthy record of sexual offenses, stretching back to the 1970s. His crimes were not impulsive. Each attack demonstrated a disturbing level of planning and a consistent, horrifying signature. Dupas's modus operandi included stabbing his victims, often removing their breasts, a brutal hallmark that would link him to multiple murders. He was arrested on April 22, 1999, and subsequently convicted of 3 murders, although he is suspected in several other cases. His sentencing spanned from 2000 to 2007, with 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, reflecting the extreme danger he posed to society and the hopelessness of his rehabilitation. Dupa was the youngest of 3 children, born into what appeared to be a fairly normal family. His family moved to Melbourne when he was a toddler, and with older siblings, he was treated like an only child. His early life gave no obvious signs of the violence to come, but at age 15, a horrifying incident foreshadowed his future. While still attending Waverley High School, Dupa stabbed his next-door neighbor in the face, neck, and hand when she refused to let him borrow a knife. The attack appeared unprovoked, and Dupa later claimed he could not explain his actions. He was placed on probation and briefly admitted to a psychiatric hospital, but this intervention failed to prevent further escalation. By 1969, Dupa had allegedly broken into the Austin Hospital mortuary, mutilating the bodies of 2 elderly women with a pathologist's knife, a grim precursor to the mutilations that would define his later murders. In the early 1970s, senior detectives and prison psychiatrists began to recognize Dupas as a serious and dangerous offender. Senior Detective Ian Armstrong described him as pure evil and warned that Dupa could go all the way, a prediction that would tragically prove accurate. In 1974, Dupa was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment for a horrific attack on a married woman, which included breaking into her home, tying her up, and raping her while threatening her baby. Psychiatrists noted that Dupa was in denial about his criminal behavior, highlighting his psychosexual problems and the difficulty of rehabilitation. His early pattern of sexual violence escalated with each release from prison. After being released in 1979, he attacked women in 4 separate incidents within 10 days. In 1980, he received a 5-year minimum sentence for multiple charges, including assault with intent to rape, malicious wounding, and indecent assault. Reports at the time described him as extremely disturbed, immature, and dangerous, warning that releasing him on parole was a mistake. After his 1985 release, he raped a 21-year-old woman on a beach at Blairgowrie, following her from his car and holding her at knife point. This crime resulted in a 12-year prison sentence, but he was released in 1992 after serving 7 years. Within 2 years, Dupa committed another violent offense, holding a woman at knife point in a public park. He was apprehended only after crashing his car while fleeing. After a short prison term, he was released in 1996 and moved to Pascoe Vale in Melbourne, where he would continue his pattern of predation. The murder of Nicole Amanda Patterson marked one of the most brutal chapters in Dupas's career. Patterson, a 28-year-old psychotherapist, was attacked in her Northcote home, which doubled as her private office. Dupas posed as a potential client, luring her into a fatal encounter on March 19, 1999. He stabbed her 27 times, removed her breasts, and stole her personal items, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. Her body was discovered by a friend who had arrived for a dinner engagement, to find Patterson mutilated and lifeless. Dupas was swiftly arrested, and the investigation revealed he had meticulously planned his attack, making several phone calls over weeks to establish Patterson's vulnerability. Police also found incriminating evidence in his home, including blood-stained clothing, PVC tape, a ski mask, and documents related to Patterson's practice. Dupa was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole on August 22, 2000.